Welcome to Solving the Conflict. This is your host, Benjamin Sklar, and today's guest is Gurney Pearsall III, a former prosecutor with the Department of Defense focused on war crimes. How you
Thank
doing,
you.
Gurney?
I'm great. How are you, Benji?
I'm really excited to have you on the show today to talk about the Israel-Hamas war and what's going on in the world today.
Let's do it. I'm excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what it means to be a former prosecutor for the Department of Defense focused on war crimes.
Sure. So I am in the Army Reserves. I joined in 2017, and the obligation is 1 week in a month. But if you want, you can volunteer for active duty service for certain periods of time. So I've been to like Korea, Fort Hood, Fort Bragg. I've been all over. There was one position I was in for 2 years, which is unusually long, but they liked me in the position. That was at the Office of Military Commissions. And what the office does is prosecute violations of the law of armed conflict. So there's two kinds. And I know we only have like half an hour, so I don't want to get too deep into it, but there are two kinds of violations. You have US soldiers or airmen, sailors, what have you, who commit arguably war crimes. They're prosecuted through the Uniform Code of Military Justice by their units. Then you have a whole other group of people who are not beholden to the UCMJ, like insurgents. That's the main person who does not belong to the army, is not beholden to the UCMJ. And how do they get prosecuted? You know, there's a question: do you go through federal court? Do they get prosecuted locally, or did they get prosecuted by the U.S. military in a court of commissions instead of a court martial for our own people? So that's what we did since the Bush administration, and since really the first war. George Washington prosecuted Major John Andre famously for espionage in violation of the law of war way back in I don't remember which year, but in the late 1700s. And in every major war, the US Civil War, the Philippine insurrection, the Korean War, Vietnam War, I mean, you name it, every major war has had commissions prosecutions. And the US Mexico War as well. That's actually where it really took off. So that's what I was doing for 2 years. And I was working mostly on appeals because, as you may know, trial is, it's great to win a trial, but you really need to win on appeal. That's where the issues can get very murky and you really need to get into the law. You might have the facts clear, but the law may be developing. And yeah, that's what I did for 2 years. It was a great job. It was fascinating to work with the CIA, to work with just so many agencies came together to prosecute insurgents. And many of them are still there. Whereas there's one Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's also there. He was the mastermind of 9/11. Bin Laden funded it and supported it, but ultimately, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed came up with the idea. He had the idea a lot earlier. He tried to pull it off, I think, in the Philippines or in Indonesia. This idea of hijacking planes and flying them into cultural centers. And at the time, it was so far-fetched, and he almost pulled it off, but it was they caught onto it and captured the would-be hijackers. So then he came to Bin Laden and said, "Let's try this again, but with more funding." Anyway, so that is what I was up to.
Fascinating. Tell me, how are you thinking about the war in Israel today?
How am I thinking? There's a lot to think about, and it's so hard to think clearly because there's such a push from so many angles to spread misinformation and to show clips from 2008. There were clips from a video game called, is it Arma or something like that? The Armed, I forget what it stands for, but there's some video game that's very realistic looking. And there are so many sides. Even I read an article that there's the Hindu rights in India. They're also really involved in this and they feel very passionately. And they're spreading all kinds of just made up stories for whatever points locally to gain politically. So anyway, what I'm thinking more is just what is the law? How does it apply? And how do you, I don't know, make the conversation more based in reality? That's, I think, is a big push.
So is Israel subject to US law when it comes to war?
Probably not, unless there is maybe some agreements. We'll give you ammunition if you use it in a certain way. There might be some agreements. But for the law of armed conflict, that is international law. So all states are subject to international law. And that comes from two sources. You have treaties like the Geneva Conventions. That's the main source of law. And then you have the customary international law. That's like the common law of war, just what states have been doing and have been avoiding. It's unwritten, but if all states or most states engage in certain conduct during wartime, then it's considered binding on all other states if it's just the norm. Very much like common law. So those are two sources, and the categories are clear. How it applies always gets more murky, and that's where a lot of interesting conversations can be held about what kind of conflict is this. That's really the first question in any law of war and law of armed conflict. They're kind of used interchangeably. They mean the same thing. In any analysis, the first question is this even a war? Or is this more like the FBI raiding Waco, Texas? There was, two armed groups at a standoff, but that's just considered police action. That's not armed conflicts under international law. So a lot of conversations. I can get into it. I don't know how much time we have.
Please get into it. This is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the two main categories, that's really the only two categories as far as international law is concerned. And this is not like a US perspective. This is just every country agrees. There is the international armed conflicts, which is what we typically call a war. Russia invading Ukraine. State-on-state violence is an IAC, what is called IAC, international armed conflict. The law of war certainly applies. That's really what it had in mind when it was invented in the late 1800s and developed with the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. That's one area. The other area is the non-international armed conflicts. Not a very creative name, but basically everything that's not state-on-state violence. So maybe you have a state versus a non-state actor, or maybe you have two non-state actors who are just in such a prolonged conflict that it's considered a NIAC. And the big question that scholars have, and jurists as well, is how do you separate NIAC from just police action? How do you separate FBI versus the Waco group, whatever they were called? How do you separate that from, let's say, Israel and Hamas, which seems much more clearly NIAC? When you have a very powerful non-state actor like Hamas or Hezbollah versus a state of Israel. And typically what they try to say, I think the norm that's developed is, because this is all new law, insurgencies were not as commonplace, not as intense in the late 1800s and even the 1940s. But over time, I think the consensus has emerged that a NIAC is prolonged and it has just a certain level of intensity of violence. Those are the two defining characteristics between just cops and robbers versus an actual armed conflict. And it's a big deal because between cops and robbers, that's just domestic law. There is no law of war concern there. But between state versus non-states, now we have law of war. Now it's international law, and it's just a whole separate analysis of what is and is not allowed.
Where does the International Criminal Court get involved here?
It can get involved if both sides consent and if both sides are state actors. So, for example, US v. Nicaragua, that's a major case that happens, I believe, in the 80s. But basically, you have two states with a dispute. And there's, well, for one, there is the International Criminal Courts, and then there's the International Court of Justice. Two very different courts. So the International Criminal Courts, and I may be confused here. I could Google it. If US v. Nicaragua, was that ICJ or ICC? That may have been ICJ. So I'm getting that confused, I think. But with the International Criminal Court, that is where, for example, they just released arrest warrants for Putin for, we have to say allegedly, I guess, because it's not been proven, but for the kidnapping of Ukrainian children and forced movement of them into Russia for, I don't know what you would call it, like re-education or just to keep them there and to, I mean, re-education is the word for it. So they released that arrest warrants. They want to prosecute. And the reason they would have jurisdiction is because Russia is a state and it has agreed to be bound by ICC jurisdiction. And that's essentially how those prosecutions work. I believe they also prosecuted in the Yugoslav war various offenders against the law of war. Right. And then the ICJ focuses, I believe, more on civil disputes, which is where US v. Nicaragua comes in. You have two states with a conflict. The US came in to, I mean, it's a whole long story. It's fascinating. But basically, you had Nicaragua. They were funding certain terror groups, or maybe call it insurgent groups, in their neighbors. And the US came in to support those neighbors and to fight back. And so Nicaragua filed the complaints. And the opinion of the court was the US cannot unilaterally come in and help somebody. There is a concept of protecting your allies and protecting certain peoples, but to just come in uninvited, they need to invite you. And so that's where the court essentially reasoned in that case. And then in the ICC, it's more of a criminal court where you have a specific offender committing crimes, typically against many peoples. And then they come up with a ruling, and that's like an international tribunal. a little bit like the Nuremberg Tribunal, except it's a permanent court instead of an ad hoc tribunal.
I believe the president of Turkey, President Erdogan, this
Mhm.
past weekend stated in a rally with hundreds of thousands of people that Israel was a war criminal and
The whole country. Okay.
it was to prosecute Israel
Uh,
as a war criminal state, or however you would define it.
sure. I mean, people say the same thing about George Bush and Barack Obama. There's, anybody, people like to use the phrase war criminal very loosely and say, oh, well, we should bring that to the international court system. But I mean, what is the crime? We need to get into specifics. The devil's in the details. So what crime is committed by whom? This is a question that we've been asking since World War One. When World War One ended, we convened an international tribunal. It was ad hoc, so we didn't have the courts we have now, but there was an ad hoc tribunal to prosecute Kaiser Wilhelm. Was that the Kaiser Wilhelm? And the accusation was he started a war of aggression. That's like the most basic crime, is to actually just invade a country purely to seize land and to engage in a war of conquest. And ultimately, they had to acquit him because they couldn't figure out, is it really, who is in charge of Germany? How do you prosecute a state for an action it takes? It has its leader. Is he personally liable for the action of the state when he has generals coming up with the plans and he has advisors, and so many people have their hands in that pot? So they ultimately decided if a state is liable for an act of aggression, that may be the case, but who is ultimately to blame for that when there are so many thousands of people involved, right? And at Nuremberg, they figured, they had the same issue, but they figured, let's prosecute the entire leadership, the politicians, doctors, lawyers, all kinds of different leaders within those segments of society. At least they should be held responsible for what they personally did. So that's where that's been evolving. And typically what happens is the country is defeated in a major war and these people are captured. And of course, then it's easier to prosecute. How do you prosecute somebody from a country that is free and has nuclear weapons? It never happens. It might be something that is in play with Russia right now if Putin actually is somehow arrested somewhere. But that would be walking into some very new territory because Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons.
So you see on social media the pro-Israel stance, which is Hamas is to blame for all of the death occurring right now in Gaza. It's
Mhm.
Hamas's fault. And you see the pro-Palestinian side
Mhm.
blaming Israel, of course. Under the laws of war, who is to blame for the deaths in Gaza?
Well, you have two levels of responsibility. For one, each person is responsible for their own actions. So if you're a soldier and you are told to shoot a civilian who is unarmed, not fighting, you are personally responsible. If we can pin down what you did and clarify that it was you who did it, that is, you would be personally liable for severe penalties. You could be imprisoned. The death penalty is a very liberally granted penalty under the law of war. So that's one level. The other level is what's called command responsibility. That is more saying that even if you personally did not pull the trigger, if you ordered it or if you knew it was going to happen and you did nothing to intervene when your subordinates commit war crimes, you are also responsible for what they've done. So you have two levels there. Between Israel and Hamas, it gets a lot more blurry because there are so many actors involved and so many people doing specific things that it's always better to look at a specific incident and say, all right, who's responsible for this? But generally, so on October 7, you have 1,000 Hamas, there's so many phrases, militants, terrorists, insurgents, whatever phrase you prefer. About 1,000 of them broke out of the border and flooded into the adjacent Israeli villages, kibbutzes, and were just killing people at random, civilians, soldiers too. And so each person is responsible there. Hamas is absolutely responsible for every bullet they fire, every rocket they shoot. When you fire indiscriminately, that is an independent war crime. Your rocket might hit nothing. It doesn't matter. Just firing it without aiming is already a war crime because the point of the law of war is to protect civilians, and firing randomly it's clearly not protecting them. You have to be targeting a military target. So they're responsible for that. You can argue more of a moral cause of, oh, it's a resistance, or, oh, they're protesting. Whatever. There's more of those kind of high level philosophical arguments about their motivations and does it justify attacking. Under the law of war, there's no justification for killing civilians or shooting indiscriminately. There's that. And then when Israel shoots back, it has responsibilities. And there are rules in the law of war. So if it intentionally targets, let's say, an apartment building, knowing it's full of civilians and knowing that there's no military connection, whoever shoots that missile is responsible. Whoever orders it is responsible. My understanding is that's not what happens. But if that's the accusation, then what people should do is look at the specific incident and look at just the facts. What are the accurate facts of what happens and when? And from there, it's easier to have an intelligent conversation for responsibility. But the nutshell answer is everyone is responsible for what they do. And there's no excuses. The people might say under the right of self-defense, for example, it's a very popular right. Hamas loves to talk about self-defense. Self-defense does not allow you, it allows you to use force lawfully, but it has its limitations. You can't just shoot indiscriminately or target civilians or what else? You can't use, for example, chemicals and biological weapons. That would be forbidden whether or not it's in self-defense. And self-defense assumes that you are under attack. So if Hamas is shooting because they're protesting about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of their main reasons for attacking, that's not self-defense. That's ultimately more of a political protest. There is no immediate threat that you are shooting back at. And just shooting randomly into the distance, somebody breaks into your house and you need to shoot in self-defense, you're not going to fire a rocket, 100 miles away. How is that? That's not self-defense. Clearly, you need to aim at what you believe the threat is, if it's actually self-defense. So I think all the arguments are just on a general philosophical level where nobody's right, nobody's wrong. It's just theories. But under the law of war, you can get really pinpointed about responsibility for specific incidents.
It's well known that Hamas's headquarters is located under one of the main hospitals in Gaza.
Al-Shira, yeah, the Al-Shira hospital.
If Israel decides to attack that headquarters,
yep,
really killing civilians, is it Hamas's fault?
This is where insurgencies get really murky. So under the law of war, you have a principle of distinction and proportionality, two key principles when you engage in a military action. The principle of distinction is that you must distinguish between civilian or really combatants and non-combatants, including distinguishing yourself from looking like a non-combatant if you are actually a combatant. That's just a overall guiding principle that so many of the rules fall into. The second principle is proportionality. So if you are engaging in a lawful, if you are intentionally targeting a lawful target, like that headquarters, what is the effect that that's going to have on civilians? If you are, let's say, dropping a bomb on one soldier and he's in the middle of nowhere, then you could drop whatever size bomb you want. It's proportional because civilians are unaffected. If he's standing in the middle of a marketplace, now you need to think about, is it worth dropping this 2,000-pound bomb on one soldier who's maybe a very low-value target and destroying the whole marketplace? Now it seems a little disproportionate between the sought-after military advantage that you gain versus all of the collateral damage, all of the death and destruction to civilians. So that's what people have to analyze when they're deciding, do we target this hospital? Is it possible to target it in a way that you destroy that Hamas headquarters without harming any civilians? There are amazing bombs these days that can fly into a window and only target whatever little areas. In all likelihood, with the way that things are constructed in Gaza, I've seen just countless videos of a building getting hit on one floor and the whole thing just collapses. So they have to keep that in mind. Like if I'm the judge advocate in a command that is saying, here, we have a target, is this a lawful target? And I need to analyze, all right, it's a hospital, they're targeting the basement, it is a valid military target because it's literally the Hamas headquarters. I mean, you have to ask, how do you know it's the headquarters? Can you confirm, or so once you confirm it really is being used for military purposes, it becomes a lawful target. And then you move on to proportionality. How many people are in the hospital? Is there a way to minimize the damages? So I know, for example, Israel said, evacuate North Gaza. Everyone needs to evacuate. That helps, but in a hospital, so many people are kind of stuck. They're on a ventilator. Maybe they can't evacuate. So it's a tough question. I don't think there's a clear right or wrong answer. If this was not the headquarters, if it was just some little Hamas, I don't know, communications outposts, would you really destroy the whole hospital for a little communications thing? That seems disproportionate. It affects civilians so much more than it affects Hamas, to put it that way. But if it's the headquarters, if this is their Pentagon, it's tricky, it's tough. Ideally, you send in the ground forces, but it could be a bloodbath. And, you don't, it's just, there's no right answer in that case. It's a really tough position that Hamas puts Israel into, and it's a thing that all insurgents do these days. They try to get a win-win out of using human shields. They put their headquarters and their stockpiles in schools and mosques and hospitals, and it puts armies that are trying to comply with the law of war in a bind. Either they don't shoot, in which case the enemy realizes, okay, we have a good signal. We need to keep hiding things in hospitals or mosques or whatever. They don't shoot. We need to keep using that for our own safety. Or if they do shoot, now you're feeding into the PR campaign of, oh, these guys are targeting civilians and these guys are just destroying mosques. Look how terrible this is. A fight, like this is a clash of civilizations. So you're feeding into the PR campaign and feeding into their recruitments. And there's seemingly no right answer. No country has really figured out how to deal with it, although there have been creative solutions. We want to get into it. Russia came up with the solution of what they call it. I think they call it draining the oceans. So in Chechnya, where they had a very similar situation, in Syria more recently with the rebels fighting Assad, Russia's solution has been to, quote, just drain the ocean, just bomb everything. Just don't forget about the law of war, just bomb everything. And it's terrible and it's worthy of protest and all that, but it's effective. If you bomb everything, at least in Russia's examples of Chechnya and Syria, the resistance seems to just dry up. You would think people kind of band together and it, reinforces the resistance, but when Russia goes really all out, the two examples that I can think of, Russia has won that fight. But we don't do that in the Western world. That is very cruel. That is exactly what the law of war advises against. You don't just bomb indiscriminately. So the Israeli solution up until October 7, from my understanding, was what they called, what was it, mowing the grass? Is that the term? Did you hear that term when you were in the army?
I've heard that before.
Yeah, like mowing the grass. Basically, not every couple of months, really every maybe 8 months or so, Hamas will build up its capacity and start firing rockets. And then you come in there, destroy as many tunnels and rockets as you can, mow the grass a little bit, but let Hamas stay in charge, because if you come in and enact regime change, who knows who's replacing Hamas? Maybe next is ISIS. Maybe, who knows? So at least there's a devil, let them rule Gaza. They won by popular votes, by all means. Maybe let them rule, but just come in there and keep depleting their stockpiles. That was mowing the grass. It arguably maybe worked for many years, but the risk is that you don't mow it quickly enough, and then October 7 happens, and they break out and commits a mass homicide. So that was one Israeli solution. One article I read more recently was it was interesting. So they were saying that for the past few weeks, maybe up until 2 days ago, they're saying phase 2 started and the ground invasion started. But up until then, what Israel was doing is, of course, they called up the reserves, surrounded Gaza, and were engaging in very small targeted attacks where they would come into Gaza, attack a certain stronghold, and then get out. And according to the article, this was almost like it was a type of counterinsurgency where you are using insurgent techniques. You're using the famous like hit and runs and sniper attacks and just really small sudden attacks, overwhelming whatever stronghold that is, and then going right back home, instead of staying in place and now getting into urban combat, which is always going to have a high amount of casualties on both sides and civilians. So that was creative. That might be a solution, but to destroy Hamas, I don't think that would really destroy Hamas as much as it would put the militants in a position of not knowing when is the next attack and where. And they were obviously hoping for a major incursion and fighting from their tunnels and whatnot. So anyway, more recently, the actual invasion began. I think there's been a internet blackout, so no one really knows, but it seems like the army has moved in, at least into northern Gaza, where they might maybe cut off north and south and focus on the targets that they know about in the Gaza area. So those are three solutions to insurgency. The fourth, famously, the U.S. tried the hearts and minds approach of public diplomacy, where you come in, remove the insurgents from power, and then build bridges, build roads, get in touch with the local leaders and give them money, give them whatever they need to build up a civil society, and hopefully democracy will blossom. It worked somewhat in Iraq. It did not work famously in Afghanistan. In certain insurgencies, so like in the Philippines insurrection, way back when, about 100 years ago, there was a huge insurrection in the Philippines, first against Spain, and there was a Spanish-American War, and we won, and then we took the Philippines. They thought they would get independence, and instead they have a new colonizer. So they had their insurgency, and it was one of the rare examples of a homegrown insurgency failing, in part because of public diplomacy, in part because of just mass reprisals from the US, and in part people assume because it just somehow was just not a popular insurgency. They need popularity to win. Those are huge factors in an insurgency. Unfortunately, with Hamas, they do seem to be very popular, according to maybe not any, but many polls that have been conducted in Gaza and the West Bank seem to show Hamas as having more than 50% of a approval rating if a vote were to be held of who should be leading the Palestinian Authority. And then Fatah, which governs the West Bank, and their approach is more about nation building through diplomacy and through coordination with Israel. Their approval rating is something like 15% or 14%. Not hopeful. But yeah, if Hamas's militants have a lot of popularity, then it's how do you destroy something like that? You're trying to destroy an idea at that point, and a popular idea, which makes it even harder.
When you hear the Israeli leadership talking today, you
Right.
hear them saying how the goal of the war is to destroy Hamas. But as you say, if Hamas represents not just a few thousand men, but the population as a whole, then how do you destroy Hamas?
Right. I mean, we tried to destroy the Taliban for something like 20 years. It is very hard. We've tried to destroy Al Qaeda, and we have vast resources, but it's like trying to destroy the idea of democracy. Their idea is resistance. I think Hamas is literally just an acronym that just means resistance. It's hard to destroy an idea like that. You might be able to there might be regime change to where they're no longer to effectively exercise control in Gaza. That may be a more realistic goal, and that may be the equivalent of destroying their political existence in Gaza. They will still be around. It's an idea, but it's more realistic if you really do have a ground invasion in Gaza and you just remove all Hamas members from their government's posts. Then I mean, basically they've been destroyed practically, if not fully. And then I assume Fatah will take over, but practically everybody knows Fatah is not popular. How long they would rule. And then the leader of Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, he's 80 something years old, so he's not going to be leader much more. He's been postponing elections since 2006, and they can't postpone it much more. If he passes away, somebody needs to lead the Palestinian Authority.
If someone wants to learn more about the laws of war, where do you recommend they go look?
Let's see. I mean, Google helps, but I know what I'm Googling, so it helps me to discern what is factual and what is not. I think the Red Cross, isn't the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, they have a fantastic website that I use often. They are not a definitive source, but really there are very few definitive sources. There's some case law, but even that's not definitive. I have CLEs for lawyers describing law of war violations in Star Wars, for example. I've been doing that for a while. I recommend my CLE, of course, but I'm biased. I try to be non-biased when I describe different rules and violations in different scenes in Star Wars. I have one coming up in a few weeks, specifically about Israel and Hamas, and that'll get into more details of what is the law of occupation, what is the law of siege, and is it happening in Gaza? What is statehood? Is Palestine a state? Is Hamas, are they a state actor? You know, are they? Because that would be a big difference if it's an international conflict or non-international. It depends if Hamas is a state actor, and they claim to be a state actor, and they were elected to represent the state of Palestine. So it's a little convoluted, but I think just from a philosophical standpoint, it's fascinating to see the rules and see how they may apply or may not, and to see how the international community takes so many positions about, let's say, the Golan Heights, West Bank. What does it mean to occupy? What exactly is occupied? And when there are so many people feeling so passionately about occupation, it helps to know what you're even talking about. What are these laws and rules and norms? So that is one option, is to go review CLEs. I don't know how many there are. I actually tried to give it on behalf of a bigger organization that gives, like, they stream CLEs nationwide. And they liked a lot of my topics. They like Star Wars, but they said for Israel Hamas, they don't want the potential somebody gets offended and now they have negative reviews on, I don't know, Better Business Bureau. So a
For
lot of
non-lawyers listening, most don't know what a CLE is.
Oh,
CL.
CE. Yes, right. So I'm getting into legalese. So continuing legal education, it's something lawyers are required to take every year. You need certain amount of credits every either year or 2 years, 3 years. So typically they're very boring. You just have like an attorney who was so close to retirement, just in a monotone voice reciting, here's what happened this year at the Supreme Court. And I remember CLE for the first few years, I would show up with my laptop. I would pay the massive fee to show up, and I would just be productive. I have no idea what's going on around me. And I figured when I left my prosecution job at the Pentagon, I was like, listen, this international law stuff is fascinating. It's totally irrelevant to anything that we do as lawyers, but it is fascinating. It's always on headlines. And it's just, why not sharpen your minds and understand what are these rules and norms? So when people are talking about occupation, at least you can provide a legal angle, a legal analysis. Yes, so that's what I do. I think I'm a good resource, and I don't know who else does it. I would say go to like there's so many CLE providers, but they all kind of shy away from law of war because it's highly charged, and they don't want that attention. They want to talk about like immigration law or something fun, contract law. Yeah.
If someone wants to reach out to you,
Yep.
where do you recommend they contact you?
Let's see. I guess we could put my email up there, Gurney@PearsallLawFirm.com. I have a website, StarWarsCLE.com. That's where I do the Star Wars thing. That would be maybe a much easier way to get to me, because there's the website, there is easily a lot of contact information and just videos that are recorded, like pre-recorded. So you can see it whenever you want. And it's a way to learn about the law of war in a way that's not charged. For people who have very strong feelings one way or the other, no matter how you describe what the law of occupation is, someone's going to get offended and say, oh, there's no way that's what it means. So learning it through pop culture and looking at maybe Star Wars, at least you can see it in a way that's not politically charged, and understand the law better. I think anything that you want to learn, you learn better when you compare it to something you already know. And maybe not everyone is a Star Wars fan, but we all know generally what it's about, Jedi and Sith and whatever. And what's great about it is that every movie in there is about war. It's about armed conflict, and and I don't know if they meant this, but every trilogy is about a different kind of armed conflict. Like in the original trilogy, I don't want to get this all into Star Wars all of a sudden, but in the original trilogy, you have an insurgency. You have the rebels fighting the Empire. That is an insurgency. That is a non-international armed conflict. In the prequels, you have state on state. You had the Galactic, the what is it called? The Galactic Republic fighting the Confederacy of Independent States. So that was state on state, like Russia versus Ukraine. And then in the sequels, you have like two gangs fighting, non-state actor versus non-state actor. But it's just fascinating how you have all three categories fitting so perfectly into the trilogies. And yeah, anyway, I just get into it for Star Wars, and they're long CLEs, 15 hours per trilogy, because
Wow.
there's so much to talk about. Because you can get into case law. There's so
We
much
don't
case
have
law.
that much
Yeah.
time. Let me
Yes, we're running out of time. I know.
fire round questions.
Yes.
What does the United Nations have to do with the law of war?
So, I mean, let's see. The international community, typically through the UN, will take certain positions. So the Golan Heights is a perfect example. In the Golan Heights, you had the country of Syria gaining independence in 1922, I think, and their border included the Golan Heights, but they kept using it to invade Israel. And so eventually Israel pushed them out of the Golan Heights, seized it, and officially that is occupied territory. You're taking the territory of another state. The question is it still occupied? So the main, for example, at the UN, they're constantly condemning it, passing resolutions saying, yes, this is still occupied. It must be returned unconditionally. But you have a minority position. You have certain states saying, well, hold on, it was used for violence. If you return it, it's going to be used for violence. The whole point of the law of war is to reduce the scale and intensity of armed conflicts. So when Israel offers to return it, as it's done at least 4 times that I can think of, and it offers it on condition of, we will give you back the Golan Heights, but can you promise not to attack us? And Syria says, no promises. So certain states will say that, you know what, it is occupied, but it is lawfully occupied because they're going to use it for violence. That's where the UN comes in, and you have different states debating of, what to condemn and what the resolutions would say. And that's just helpful for maybe figuring out the common law of war. Yes. And the US position is fascinating. The US says Golan Heights is now Israeli because if it were to return to Syria, it will be used for violence. The Syrian government is gassing its own people. Why would we give them more territory? Basically, the doctrine of unclean hands. That's why would they get a windfall from Israel complying with the law of war by giving back this territory? But the US is the only state that has adopted that position. But it's fascinating. It's just, so many arguments you can have. International law is very kind of ethereal in that sense. Yes.
Before you hop off, Gurney, tell us how you recommend we think about the remainder of the war in Gaza.
I would say think in specifics. So people say there is, I don't know, a genocide, ethnic cleansing, a disproportionate use of force, whatever specific term they use, the term has a meaning, a very specific meaning, and there are cases illustrating it. There is so much history behind each word. It doesn't mean just anything that you find disagreeable. So think in specifics of what exactly happens, and I mean, you need to know what these words mean as well, but think in specifics, because that really helps versus just saying generally, oh, Hamas is not responsible for anything because it's resistance and resistance is allowed. That's not how it works. In the practice of law, we always think in facts, very specific facts, and the law of war is no different.
Thank you so much, Gurney, for hopping on the show today. I learned so much from this conversation. I want it to last another
And
few
have
hours.
follow-ups, depending on what happens, there will be specific incidents, and there's lots to talk about.
I'd love to have you on the show again, Gurney.
All right, I'll be back. Thanks for having me, Benji.
Thank you so much.
I'll have better lighting next time too. I look like a hostage right now.
You look fantastic.
All right.
And for those to know, Gurney and I grew up together. We go
way back to Houston. And then we both joined the army at different armies at roughly the same time. You were a paratrooper. I was a paratrooper for 6 months, but not that long anyway.
Incredible.
Converged in a way. All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.